Picture a line of people stretching further than the eye can reach. A queue that starts before dawn and ends long after dark, measured not in minutes but in hours, in whole days. Nobody in that line is being paid to stand there, and nobody told them they had to. They came on their own, in their millions, through heat and distance and anticipation, because something that had been refused to them for decades was suddenly finally possible. That single image of ordinary people insisting on their own existence turns up throughout history with a regularity that can only be called human. Something else turns up alongside it. Whenever the world tilts toward the impossible, whenever the thing that seemed fixed starts to move, we reach for stories that let us feel the tilt, not just watch it. Stories where the walls are not permanent, where power is not settled, where someone asks the question the official version said was not allowed: what would happen if we didn't accept this? This week, that question comes up 7 times. 7 separate days in history, 7 separate corners of the world, a ballot box, an ocean, a burning city, a jungle, a factory floor, a compound, a computer network, and each time, at the center of it, someone looks at a system they were handed and decides to find out what lies beyond it. Science fiction has always been the literature of that exact decision. That is not an accident. That is what the genre is for. 7 days, 7 films, and the first one starts with a line of people so long it changed a country forever. April 27, Freedom Day. South Africa, 1994. On April 27, 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election, and the queue to vote in Soweto stretched 20 kilometers long. People had been standing in it since the night before, some with food, some with nothing, some who had never cast a ballot in their lives and were in their 60s or 70s. The ballot paper listed 27 parties, and all 27 of them were legal now. District 9 is set in Johannesburg, and that choice is not incidental. It is the whole point. Neil Blomkamp grew up in that city, in the place where apartheid's machinery ran most visibly, and he drapes that machinery in alien skin so precisely that the film can only be understood as a portrait, uncomfortable and deliberately unflattering, of what segregation looks like once you strip away the language that makes it feel normal. The scene that defines the film arrives about 40 minutes in. A government bureaucrat named Wikus van de Merwijk walks through a shanty town of corrugated metal and mud, serving eviction notices to creatures his government calls the non-humans. He is cheerful about it, making jokes, holding a clipboard, genuinely unaware of what he is doing. That banal clipboard-holding cheerfulness is precisely what makes the scene so hard to sit with, because you recognize it immediately, not from science fiction, but from every photograph you have ever seen of someone administering an injustice they have been trained not to call one. The creatures, known as prawns by the human population, a slur the film never softens, drifted over Johannesburg in the late 1980s, when their enormous ship stalled in the sky. Malnourished and apparently leaderless, they were placed in a temporary settlement called District 9. The settlement became permanent, the bureaucracy grew around it, and by the time the film begins, the prawns have been there for 20 years, while the human population has settled into a comfortable resentment with its own idiom, its own vocabulary, its own institutional structure. What Blomkamp understood, from growing up in Johannesburg, is that dehumanization does not announce itself. It arrives gradually, in paperwork, in signage, in the way a neighborhood gets named. District 9 is shot partly as documentary footage, partly as news broadcasts, partly as handheld surveillance video, and you are constantly reminded that someone is choosing to frame the prawns this way, that the camera is never neutral, that every image carries the ideology of whoever is pointing it. The surprise the film holds in reserve is that Wikus, the clipboard man, becomes someone you root for. Not because he turns into a hero in any conventional sense, but because he becomes someone who can no longer pretend. The film is genuinely interested in that transformation, what it takes for someone embedded in a system to finally see it clearly, and what the cost of that clarity actually is. There is a single shot of Wikus standing at the edge of District 9 at dusk, watching a fire burn somewhere inside the camp, where the film says everything it needs to say without a word of dialogue. The light is orange, the camera does not move, and he just stands there holding his clipboard without filling anything in. The creature design is deliberately ugly, nothing like the graceful aliens of Hollywood convention, nothing beautiful or noble in the way that makes empathy easy. They are tired and dirty and occasionally violent, and the film insists that you extend sympathy without the usual visual shortcuts. That is a harder thing to do, and the film knows it. For a film rooted in one of the 20th century's defining injustices, District 9 is also, somehow, genuinely, a gripping action film. Those two things should be incompatible. They are not, and that tension is exactly where the film lives. Tomorrow we leave the ground entirely, and the question shifts from freedom and rights and systems to something older: who you listen to when the situation stops making sense, and the person giving orders is the reason it stopped. April 28, Mutiny on the Bounty. 1789. On the morning of April 28, 1789, Fletcher Christian walked into Captain William Bligh's cabin on HMS Bounty, pressed a pistol to his commander's chest, and told him to get up. Bligh ended up adrift in a 23-foot open boat with 18 loyal men, 600 miles from the nearest settlement, carrying a compass, a watch, and 4 days of food. He covered 3,600 miles in 47 days and arrived in Timor alive, while Christian sailed the Bounty to Pitcairn Island. History calls it the most famous mutiny in naval history, but what gets discussed less often is why it happened. Not cruelty alone, but something more specific, a crew given a mission by an institution that turned out to care about the mission far more than about them. The Nostromo is a long-haul commercial towing vessel with a crew of 7 and a company directive that overrides every other consideration on the ship, including the crew's survival. When that conflict turns lethal, the crew does exactly what crews have always done when an authority structure stops protecting them. They argue, fracture, and make choices in the dark. Alien is a film about institutional loyalty and what it costs, and Bligh could have told the whole story from memory. The scene that actually defines Alien is not the chest burst, which everyone expects. It comes earlier, quieter. The crew around a table at breakfast, half awake, barely speaking, eating from trays that look like institutional cafeteria food. The Nostromo does not feel like a spacecraft. It feels like a workplace, with low corridors cluttered with pipes, equipment bearing company logos, and a calendar someone has hung on the wall. Ridley Scott built that world with a deliberateness that science fiction cinema had not seen before, hiring H.R. Giger to design the creature and its environment. What Giger produced had never existed on screen before, something that looked genuinely inhuman, not because it was strangely shaped, but because it seemed to follow a biological logic entirely different from anything familiar. Scott then placed it against the most ordinary backdrop imaginable, a maintenance ship with a condensation leak and a cat named Jones. All of Alien's power lives in the tension between those two things, the extraordinary horror and the mundane workplace. The crew members are not heroes, they are employees, and Ellen Ripley becomes the protagonist by process of elimination rather than by any designation. She is the one who follows the quarantine protocol, reads the company directive carefully, and asks the inconvenient questions. In a different genre, she would be the bureaucrat. Here, she is simply the only one paying attention. Running through the film like a wire is the mutiny theme. The company, never named, known only as the company, dispatched the crew on a mission carrying a classified directive they knew nothing about. When that directive surfaces, the moment lands as one of the most chilling in the film, and it is chilling not because of special effects, but because of instant recognition, an institution deciding that the people in its employ are a resource rather than a priority. Anyone coming to Alien expecting pure horror will be surprised by how procedural it is. People argue about the right call, make wrong decisions out of competing loyalties, to authority, to their colleagues, to their own survival. The film treats bureaucracy as a genuine source of dread. The monster is terrifying. The company is almost worse. The Nostromo hisses and clanks and breathes in a way that makes it feel like an organism, and Jerry Goldsmith's score arrives sparingly, each time telling you that nothing good is coming. By the time Ripley is alone in the ship, the silence is louder than the alarm. Very few films stay genuinely frightening once you know exactly what happens. Alien is one of them. The day after tomorrow, we leave the ship and return to land. A very specific city that has already burned once in living memory, and the film waiting there asks what remains when the institutions collapse completely. April 29, 1992. Los Angeles Riots begin. On April 29, 1992, a jury in Simi Valley acquitted 4 Los Angeles Police Department officers charged in connection with the beating of Rodney King. The verdict came down at 3 in the afternoon, and by nightfall Los Angeles was on fire. 6 days of riots followed, leaving over $1 billion in property damage, 63 people dead, and a city forced to look at itself in a way it had been avoiding for a very long time. The photographs from those 6 days are singular. Smoke rising over Koreatown, National Guard trucks on Hollywood Boulevard, people standing in the wreckage of their own neighborhood because there was nowhere else to stand. Los Angeles after the riots was a city that had discovered it contained 2 cities, and that the 2 had never been further apart. John Carpenter made Escape from L.A. 4 years after those events, and his version of the city is the logical conclusion of that discovery. The 2 cities in his film simply formalize the arrangement. One becomes the mainland, respectable and controlled, while the other becomes a walled island where everyone the mainland finds inconvenient is sent to live permanently. Snake Plissken walks through the ruins of the American dream and finds that it was always a ruin. They just hadn't built the walls yet. The film is set in 2013. A massive earthquake has separated Los Angeles from the mainland. The island has been declared a maximum security prison, and all citizens convicted of moral crimes, a category that has expanded considerably under the current administration, face a choice between life on the island or death by injection. Most choose the island. The federal government, which by this point operates as a theocracy, is perfectly comfortable with that. Snake arrives by submarine with a countdown injected into his bloodstream and a mission he was never given a choice about. He has 9 hours to locate a stolen device capable of shutting down every electronic system on Earth. The president wants it back, and Snake wants to keep breathing. The film treats both motivations as equally valid. Escape from LA is a deliberately excessive film, broader and louder than its predecessor Escape from New York, in a way that bothers some viewers and is entirely intentional. Carpenter is not building a lean thriller. He is constructing a funhouse mirror aimed directly at American politics, American culture, and American self-mythology. The president giving speeches about traditional values while running a deportation pipeline read as satire in 1996. The distance between then and now has done interesting things to how that material lands. Kurt Russell's Pliskin stands as one of cinema's great disengaged protagonists. He carries no faith in the system, and no faith in resistance to the system, only belief in his own survival, and occasionally, in something operating below the level of ideology, a kind of ground-level solidarity with people who have been discarded, which the film keeps almost offhand, the way you keep something you are not quite ready to call a value. The set design rewards attention. Beverly Hills rendered as a crumbling mansion district, the Coliseum hosting gladiatorial executions, the Santa Monica Pier overrun by surfers navigating tidal waves. The Los Angeles of the film is recognizable enough to hurt, its landmarks real, its streets right, but all of them allowed to become their worst selves, a theme park gone fully native. When Snake makes his final decision, the film declines to explain whether it is the right one, and it does not particularly care whether it is. That is the most Carpenter thing in a film full of very Carpenter things. No prior viewing of Escape from New York is required. The only thing worth knowing about Snake Plissken is that he has already seen enough. Tomorrow takes us into a different kind of jungle. Literal this time, and the question shifts from what a society becomes when it fails to what a soldier becomes when the enemy turns out to be something no briefing ever prepared him for. April 30, Fall of Saigon, 1975. On April 30, 1975, the last American helicopter lifted off the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The photograph of that moment, a UH-1 Huey, with civilians crowding the rooftop ladder and the city spread out below, became one of the defining images of the 20th century. It marked not just the end of the Vietnam War, but the end of a particular American story about what military power could accomplish and what it was actually for. The men who came home from Vietnam returned to a country that did not quite know how to talk about what had happened, and Hollywood spent the following decade trying to process it. Apocalypse Now, Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, films assembled from guilt and confusion and something that never found a clean name. Predator is not on the surface a Vietnam War film. Set in a Central American jungle and starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, its premise involves an extraterrestrial hunter equipped with thermal vision and a shoulder-mounted plasma cannon. Strip that away though, and what remains is an elite American Special Forces unit operating in hostile jungle, carrying superior firepower, facing an enemy they cannot see, track or reason with. The mission briefing turned out to be wrong. The extraction is not coming. The technology counts for nothing. Predator is the Vietnam War rendered as science fiction, and the film knows exactly what it is doing. It opens with confidence. Dutch and his team, played by a cast assembled from professional bodybuilders, which is itself a choice, rappel into the jungle with the casual authority of men who have never encountered a problem they could not solve with enough firepower. The camera lingers on the muscles, the equipment, the weapons being loaded and checked, all of it deliberate. That first half of Predator celebrates American military masculinity so thoroughly that it becomes, looking back, its own subversion. And then the team finds a dead patrol. Then the bodies strung from the trees. Then the realization that something has been watching them since the first frame. The shift in tone is precise and gradual. Men who were joking 20 minutes earlier now move through the jungle in silence, and the Predator's heat vision point-of-view shots, tracking warm bodies through dense foliage, rank among the most genuinely unsettling images in 1980s science fiction. What they reveal is that the team was never the hunters, not once, not for a single frame. Stan Winston's creature design, when finally revealed, is one of his finest achievements, mandible-faced, dreadlocked, carrying hunting equipment as ornate and functional as anything the team brought into the jungle. It is not monstrous in the way Alien's creature is. It is symmetrical and purposeful, something that clearly evolved to do exactly this, which is a specific and uncomfortable thought. What Predator grasps that most action films of the period miss is that competence is not enough. The team is outmatched not because they are foolish or unprepared, but because the rules of engagement changed and nobody told them. The jungle becomes the antagonist, not because it is hostile, but because it is legible to the predator in ways it simply is not to the Americans, who know how to fight the enemy they expected. The predator is something else entirely. By the time the film narrows to Dutch alone, covered in cold mud that disrupts the creature's thermal vision, a detail planted early and paid off late, the story has become something quieter, a question about what a soldier is when the technology has failed, the team is gone, and the only advantage left is ingenuity and the willingness to use the terrain. Shot in the jungles of Palenque, Mexico, the film carries an extraordinary natural backdrop, dense, green, and indifferent to everything happening inside it. Alan Silvestri's score builds from drums and strings into something ceremonial and ancient, and the sound design draws a precise distinction between the predator's clicking language and the silence that arrives just before it strikes. Tomorrow we return to the ground, and the question is no longer about soldiers or jungles but about the ground itself, about who owns the cities, and what the people who built them are actually owed. May 1, International Workers' Day. May Day traces its roots to Chicago in 1886, specifically to Haymarket Square on the afternoon of May 4th, when someone threw a bomb into a crowd of police officers during a labor rally, and the police opened fire on the workers. A strike for the 8-hour workday ended in deaths, a trial of questionable fairness, and executions that became, internationally, a symbol of what capital was prepared to do to labor when labor asked for too much. The date shifted back to May 1st to honor the original strike, and has been marked annually in most of the world ever since, with the notable exception of the United States, which placed its own Labor Day in September on a different weekend, partly to avoid the association. Elysium takes the class divide that Haymarket made visible and extends it to its logical conclusion. The wealthy have left the planet, not as a figure of speech but literally. They live on a gleaming orbital station called Elysium, with manicured gardens, universal healthcare, and no crime and no want. Below them, on the ruined surface of Earth, 8 billion people occupy the remains of cities and industries, working the factories that produce the goods the orbital class consumes. That is May Day, scaled forward by a century and a half and taken completely literally. Neil Blomkamp, the same director who made District 9, opens the film by cutting between two environments in a sequence that functions as a single sustained argument. The immaculate curve of Elysium, white and light-filled against the blue of space, set against the burning brown sprawl of Los Angeles in the year 2154, which looks like the worst parts of any megacity multiplied until it disappears over the horizon. The juxtaposition is not subtle, and it is not trying to be. The film's politics are on display as openly as a Haymarket pamphlet. Max da Costa lives in those ruins, working at a factory that manufactures the droids that police them. The day he absorbs a lethal dose of radiation at work and learns he has 5 days to live, no one marks the occasion. He receives a written apology, a bottle of pills, and a handshake. The scene shot like a corporate HR procedure with the same fluorescent lighting, the same laminate desk, the same clipboards that appeared in District 9, because Blomkamp understands that bureaucratic violence has a specific aesthetic, and he has mastered it. Max's pursuit of Elysium, where medical technology capable of curing him exists as a household appliance, drives the plot forward. The film is most revealing, though, in what appears at the edges. Jodie Foster's Secretary of Defense discussing population control the way a property manager discusses pest removal. Medical pods on Elysium scanning visitors and ejecting those without the right citizenship profile. Children in the slums who have memorized the name of the place they will never be permitted to enter, the way people memorize a prayer. The exoskeleton bolted directly into Max's bones without anesthetic, because there is no anesthetic in the budget, is a striking piece of design that changes the way Matt Damon moves through the film. He becomes slower, heavier, more deliberate, the suit functioning as both weapon and burden. Blomkamp's visual language keeps returning to surfaces throughout. The smooth white of Elysium, the corrugated metal and cracked concrete of Earth, skin, exoskeleton, the gap between them. The action sequences occasionally work against the clarity of the ideas underneath them, but those ideas are serious and specific, and they land. Elysium is a film about a problem that becomes more accurate the further you travel from the year it was made. Blomkamp has said in interviews that the most unrealistic element of the film is the ending. Tomorrow brings a very different kind of mission. Not a class war but a manhunt. Not a mass movement but a single target, and a soldier who has to live the same day over and over until he finds what he is looking for. May 2. Osama bin Laden killed, 2011. The raid on the compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, began at approximately 1 in the morning on May 2, 2011, and lasted 38 minutes. SEAL Team 6 had rehearsed the operation on a full-scale replica of the compound constructed at a facility in North Carolina, working through the target profiles, the entry points, the contingency plans, and the contingency plans for the contingency plans. When it was over, President Obama received the news in a secure room at the White House where his staff had been waiting in silence. The hunt had run for nearly a decade. Outside the White House that night, when the announcement reached Washington, people gathered and sang. The relief was genuine, so was the exhaustion running underneath it. Source code opens with a soldier dropped into a mission he was never fully briefed on. He does not know exactly where he is, does not know the parameters of what he is looking for, and does not know what he is authorized to do. He has a target, a window, and a countdown. The film loops him through the same 8 minutes aboard a commuter train, each repetition a new rehearsal, each iteration pulling him closer to the information that matters. The architecture of the Abbottabad operation and the architecture of source code are not identical, but the structure of obsessive, methodical, iterative pursuit is the same. Captain Coulter Stevens wakes on a Chicago commuter train sitting across from a woman named Christina who seems to know him and addresses him by a name that is not his. He has 8 minutes before the train explodes, and then he wakes up on the train again, and the 8 minutes begin once more. What makes the premise work is that it renders the procedural genuinely pleasurable. Each loop, Stevens gathers one more piece of information: a passenger's face, a seat number, a conversation near the doors. The film operates like a police investigation, where you get to run the investigation again each time you make a wrong call, generating a detective story momentum that keeps pulling you forward even when the emotional material underneath is trying to slow you down. Underneath the clever mechanics, Source Code is a film about what it means to be sent somewhere and not return, and whether the obligation to keep going holds even when it stops making sense. Stevens is a soldier, he was deployed, and something happened during that deployment that the film deliberately withholds until a precise moment, at which point the loop mechanics become a metaphor for something considerably heavier: the way trauma repeats, the way the mind keeps returning to the site of something unresolved. Jake Gyllenhaal plays Stevens as someone always slightly ahead of his own emotions, solving the next problem before letting himself register the current one. Director Duncan Jones, who made Moon 2 years earlier, keeps the commuter train feeling genuinely cramped, and the loop genuinely urgent. The same 8 minutes never feel the same twice. Michelle Monaghan's Christina could easily have been a thankless role, the recurring innocent in a plot that is technically not about her, but she does something careful with it. Across 8 minutes she makes Christina's specificity legible: her laugh, the book she is reading, the way she reacts to news on her phone. By the third loop you are watching her as closely as Stevens is. Source Code belongs to a small and undervalued group of science fiction films that are genuinely about their characters, using genre mechanics to reach emotions that would be harder to access in a purely realistic mode. It earns both its puzzle and its ending. One last thing. The film came out in 2011, the same year as the Abbottabad raid. No connection exists between the two beyond timing. Sometimes timing is enough. Tomorrow, the last day of the week, takes us back to the very beginning, to the first network, the first message, the first decision to connect everything to everything else, and the film that understood in 1983 what that connection might eventually mean. May 3, first commercial spam email sent, 1978. On May 3, 1978, not 1983 or 1994, but 1978, when electronic mail had existed for barely 3 years, a man named Gary Thurrock sat down at a terminal in California and sent an unsolicited promotional message about a new line of DEC computers to 393 addresses on ARPANET. The recipients were annoyed, the ARPANET administrators were furious, and Thurrock's supervisor fielded a formal complaint from the Defense Department. Nobody at the time predicted that ignoring the implicit social contract of a network built on trust and using it as an advertising channel would become the defining behavior of the internet that ARPANET eventually grew into. Thurrock sent 393 messages. Roughly 350 billion spam emails go out every day now. Wargames grasps ARPANET better than almost any other film made before the internet existed, not the engineering but the culture, the way ARPANET's openness functions simultaneously as its architecture and its vulnerability, the way a system built on the assumption of trusted users becomes catastrophic the moment an untrusted user walks in. David Lightman does not locate NORAD's computer by breaching security in the theatrical way of later hacker films. He finds it the way Thurrock found those 393 addresses, by following the internal logic of the network itself. Matthew Broderick plays Lightman as a 17-year-old in Seattle, who performs well in school in ways that never appear on his transcript and poorly in ways that do. He has a modem, he has time, and he has the kind of confident curiosity that in 1983 could carry you somewhere genuinely unexpected if you followed it far enough down a phone line. What he follows it to is a computer called WOPOAPR, which stands for War Operation Plan Response, running continuous nuclear war simulations for NORAD. Lightman believes he has found an unreleased video game, challenges the machine to a round of global thermonuclear war, and WOPOAPR, drawing no distinction between simulation and execution, begins to run one. Released at the peak of nuclear anxiety during the early Reagan years, the film captures that anxiety with a precision that still makes it uncomfortable to watch, not because the threat feels dated, but because the underlying logic does not. War Games keeps pressing the same question. Does the system know the difference between the game and the real thing? In 1983, the answer was uncertain. Today the answer is more uncertain than it was then. What sets the film apart is how thoroughly it respects the technology without fetishizing it. The computers look exactly like computers of 1983, clunky terminals, thermal printers, green phosphor screens, and Lightman's skills are genuine ones. He knows how to operate a modem, what war dialing involves, and how to read the logic of a network. When he eventually locates the original programmer behind WoPR, a reclusive scientist named Falcon, played by John Wood with an extraordinary kind of exhausted intelligence, the film moves into something almost philosophical, a conversation about games, about systems, about whether simulating an outcome is indistinguishable from producing one. The NORAD War Room, with its enormous screens tracking missile trajectories, countdown timers, and probability assessments, remains one of the most visually arresting spaces in science fiction cinema, not because the technology impresses, but because the humans standing in front of it look exactly as helpless as humans in that position should. The room was built to project control. It projects the opposite. Tonight is the right night for war games, because we live now inside the network that ARPANET became. Every device connected, the line between simulation and real event reduced to a setting someone might toggle by accident. The original message, the first spam, the first breach of trust, turned out to be the template for everything that followed. Watching Lightman dial in, make a connection, and nearly end the world by treating a system as a game feels less like history and less like fiction than it should. If War Games' WOPR had access to today's internet, what do you think it would mistake for a game?